On Tuesday afternoon, the sunlight slanted through the tall sash windows of Studio 3, gilding the jars of tempera and the cheap plastic palettes that Harriet Talbot laid out for the late autumn creative group. She hummed as she worked, pleased by the faint smell of turpentine and hot radiator smells she associated with her own student days, before she retrained as an art therapist. At 39, with sensible shoes and a mild coffee habit, Harriet loved St. Augustine's Hospital in the same contradictory way one loves an eccentric relative. There were leaks in the roof of Ward B, endless budget meetings, and an elevator that refused to stop at the second floor. But there was also a feeling, hard to define, that making things here mattered. At 2 o'clock, the patients began to arrive. David Proctor, once a lecturer in medieval history before schizophrenia uprooted his life, moved straight for the paper as he always did, sleeves already rolled. Rose McKenna, an anorexic sixth former with the shaky poise of a frightened foal, perched on the edge of a stool. Winston Jarrell, a broad-shouldered veteran with PTSD, selected the far corner, headphones dangling round his neck in case the world became too loud. Harriet's prompt that day was simple: somewhere you'd like to feel safe. She demonstrated a wet-on-wet sky, then stepped back. Music, low-volume Debussy filled the gaps where conversation could not. For 40 minutes she circulated, offering spare brushes and gentle questions. When she reached David's easel, she paused. There, framed by a Prussian blue horizon, was a modest seaside cottage. White, rendered dulled by age, sash windows trimmed in cobalt, a single stone chimney and a weather-beaten veranda boxed in by dune grass. A red lobster buoy hung from a rusted hook beside the door, and, behind the house, chalk cliffs rose like pale giants. "It just came to me," David murmured, embarrassed by her scrutiny. "I wish I could go inside." "It's beautiful," Harriet said, marking the usual clinical notes in her mind: consistent perspective, controlled brushstrokes, melancholy palette. She praised his work, but the image lingered with her longer than most patient pieces. When the session ended and the others shuffled out, she found herself returning to the easel. The composition was so specific it felt photographic. The following week, Winston arrived early. When Harriet rounded the supply cupboard, she froze. He too was painting a cottage by the sea. She recognized the chipped blue woodwork, the boo, the line of white cliffs. Winston's version leaned stormier, greyer clouds, an unlit window domed in shadow, but it was unquestionably the same building. "Did you maybe see that in David's painting?" she asked casually. Winston shook his head. David, he rarely engaged beyond what was necessary. The man lived behind a rampart of trauma memories. "Never noticed. Thought this was just something I dreamed about when I was in." He caught himself, cleared his throat, and dabbed more grey into the sky. 2 patients, 2 weeks, identical cottage. Coincidences happened. Harriet filed the detail under peculiar but not impossible and went about her paperwork. The tally reached 5 by December. Rose, who spent whole mornings staring at untouched toast, produced a fragile watercolor of the same house but with a woman in a yellow dress standing at the threshold. Matt, a manic-depressive swing to the veranda beam. Zorai, an elderly Iranian poet with early Alzheimer's, sketched only the red buoy bobbing in undulating tide. Yet Harriet recognized the background silhouette of distant cliffs. The artists shared no diagnoses, no group therapy slots save art, and no overlapping history. They did not sit together, did not discuss motifs, and in David's case had already been discharged weeks earlier. Harriet pinned photocopies of the images side by side on her office corkboard. The scene, repeated in oil, gouache, pencil, and charcoal, gained an uncanny solidity, like frames from a single film. She slept restlessly that night, dreamt the smell of sea salt and flaking paint, and woke with a sentence thrumming in her skull: "Someone's trying to be found." The sensible part of her urged restraint. Symbolic resonance, shared archetypes, magpies of the subconscious, She could recite a dozen analytical explanations. Still, she opened her laptop. Search term: White Cottage, Cliff Coast, Boy Blue Door. Hundreds of holiday rentals surfaced. She added England, missing girl, red boy. Nothing useful. At 2:30 in the morning she closed the lid, annoyed at herself, but a small spark of resolve remained. 3 days later, Harriet stayed late to finish insurance forms. The hospital corridor outside her office was dark, except for the night nurse desk lamp. On her way out, she passed the notice board by the lift. Posters for smoking cessation, for staff choir rehearsals, for an upcoming blood drive. And right at the edge, yellowing at the corners, was a flyer she had never noticed. Missing June 1992. The black and white photograph showed a young woman. Long hair, broad smile, dimpled cheeks. Underneath, a police sketch artist's reconstruction of last probable location. Harriet's breath snapped. It was the cottage? The drawing lacked color, but the proportions were exact, down to the stub of chimney in the single upstairs window, offset to the right. She peeled the fragile sheet from the board. Who still displayed a 3 decades-old poster in a modern hospital wing? The paper smelt faintly of mildew, as if it had lived years in a filing cabinet. Name: Eleanor May Trent. Age of disappearance, 24. Last seen: 14 June 1992, Cobber's Cove, Norfolk Coast. Any information, please contact Detective Inspector Gareth Wilcox, Norfolk Constabulary. Harriet stood rooted while the lift pinged open and shut without her. One of her patients had been born in 1998, another in 2004, yet they painted this place from memory they did not have. The following morning she sought out the facilities manager, begging 10 minutes in the basement archives. A disgruntled porter unlocked a narrow room crammed with rusted filing drawers and forgotten medical equipment. She traced the sticker on one cabinet: Community Health Campaigns 19891995. Inside, bundled with publicity about nutrition and road safety, were 50 copies of the same missing persons flyer. St. Augustine's, she learned later, had hosted a memorial lecture on mental health in the wake of Eleanor Trent's disappearance, advocating more support for families left behind. Whoever filed the spares must have tacked one to the board, and no one had thought to replace it since. Harriet borrowed a copy, scanned it, and emailed herself. Then she rang the Norfolk Constabulary. Did they still have a case officer for a 30-year-old disappearance? Retired years ago, the receptionist said. But I'll pass your details to our historical investigations team. 48 hours passed without reply. Harriet's rational mind regained the microphone and chided the rest of her. She was a clinician, not a detective. She had responsibilities, group dynamics to manage, group proposals to compile, a budget proposal due. She ripped the photo prints off her corkboard, stuffed them in a drawer, and concentrated on work. But the world had decided otherwise. On a Wednesday morning in early January, Rose McKenna collapsed in the cafeteria. The crash of crockery summoned staff from every direction. Harriet, arriving last, found Rose shaking on the linoleum, lips blue, hypothermia compounded by bradycardia. In the ambulance, Rose drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering something Harriet strained to catch. Still in the Cliff House, needs help, Liston. At St. Bartholomew's A&E, the girl was stabilized. Harriet waited in the relatives' chairs, though she was neither friend nor family, until the registrar permitted a 5-minute visit. Rose lay tethered to IV fluids, her voice papery. "The woman in the pictures," she whispered. "She keeps knocking. If someone opens the door, she can go home." "Rose? What woman?" Harriet asked gently. But the girl slipped into exhausted sleep. That night, Harriet reread everything she could locate on Eleanor Trent. The digital newspaper archive supplied deathless headlines. Local student vanishes after party. Close found on beach. Police fear full play. The inquest recorded an open verdict. No body, no evidence of suicide. Eleanor had been studying at Queen Mary University. She'd rented a summer cottage in Cobber's Cove while preparing her thesis on 17th-century women diarists. Friends described her as intrepid, fond of solitary dawn walks. A waitress saw her eating breakfast overlooking the tide. Then nothing, a single photograph accompanied most articles. Eleanor on the cottage veranda, arms flung wide, hair whipped by wind. The background matched exactly the paintings Harriet's patients had produced. Harriet printed the image, tacked it again on her board, and considered the problem clinically. She believed in symbols, in trauma echoing across minds, but she also believed in data. 6 separate individuals had delivered, unprompted, renderings of a site tied to an unsolved case whose details were not common London knowledge. Occam's razor demanded a communication path. Either they had seen the poster possible, but none had reason to read an obscure sheet in a staff area, or they were being primed by Harriet herself, unlikely, her neutral language recorded in session audio, or something else. She caught herself contemplating the words psychic imprint and scoffed. But imagination is elastic. Once stretched, it does not quite shrink back. On her next day off, Harriet caught the 7:12 train to Norwich, then a bus that rattled over Saltmarsh to the hamlet of Cobber's Cove. The village offered one pub, one lifeboat station, and an L-shaped high street of flint cottages. Tourist season was over. Shutters clacked in cold wind. Harriet walked the coastal path north, boots crunching frost. After 30 minutes, the cliffs kinked inward to reveal a dip of sand and dune grass. Below, perched on a rocky shelf, stood the cottage. Time had done its work. The white render was now mottled grey, sections flaked to reveal underlying brick, window panes bordered. The veranda sagged like a mouth missing teeth, but the proportions were right. Even the tarnished buoy still hung beside the door. A half-rotted timber fence barred easy access. Harriet followed a goat track to the rear, climbed down a scrubby ledge, and stepped onto the veranda. Nailed to the doorframe was a police seal dated 1995. She circled the structure, noting a crack that ran from roofline to foundation where the cliff behind had shifted. Weather, she thought, or subsidence. The property looked unloved, unsold. No one had lived here since the investigation. A noise metallic hollow made her turn. The red buoy rocked on its hook, though there was no wind. "Hello," she called, feeling ridiculous. The sea answered, hissing on shingle. She tried to peer through a gap in the boards. Inside lay only darkness. But her chest tightened, as if someone pressed 2 cold hands against her ribs. She felt certain the house was not empty. The rational part of her brain shrieked, "Leave!" She made herself step back, photograph the exterior, then retreat to the path. By the time she reached the lifeboat station, she was shivering. The pub keeper, a grey-haired woman polishing glasses, raised a brow when Harriet asked for information. "The Trent house? Bad business. Nobody wants to buy land under a curse." "You believe it's cursed?" The woman shrugged. "I believe the cliffs are crumbly, the roof's rotten, and there's talk of screams on foggy nights. That's enough for most." She poured Harriet tea and added, softly, "Her mother still writes letters. Posts them to the address every June. They come back, undeliverable, of course. She just wants her daughter home." Harriet thanked her and left. That evening, back in London, the Historical Investigations Officer finally phoned. Detective Sergeant Amina Khalid had a crisp voice that suggested permanent caffeine levels. "We got your message about St. Augustine's Hospital. You said multiple patients are producing imagery matching a 30-year-old crime scene. That right?" Harriet braced for skepticism. "Yes, I have copies. I can supply timestamps." "Please do. We're digitizing cold case files. Any new angle helps. Unscheduled witness statements aren't typical, but if your patients consent to interview—" "They're vulnerable," Harriet cut in. "Several lack capacity for formal questioning." "Understood. But you might be interested to learn we're reopening ground searches near the property. Geological survey detected an anomaly behind the east wall, something missed in 92. If you've got anything further, let me know. Harriet hung up, trembling. An anomaly? A cavity in the cliff. A place one might hide or bury something. At 3 the next morning, Harriet's phone chimed. Rose's vitals had destabilized. Could Harriet attend for therapeutic reassurance? She threw on jeans and rushed across the city. Rose looked ghost-thin against the ward pillows. When Harriet arrived, she opened fever-bright eyes. "Did you find her?" the girl whispered. "Not yet," Harriet admitted. "She's waiting in the dark part of the house. She can't leave until someone brings her outside." "Rose, how do you know that?" "I see her in dreams. She asks me to paint, so you'll understand." Harriet squeezed Rose's hand. "Thank you," she said, meaning it. Days merged. The police deployed ground-penetrating radar. The hospital released Winston home. Sarai forgot Harriet's name but recited, in flawless English, a poem about cliffs and yearning. David sent a postcard from his new supported flat. "It's quiet here. I still imagine the sea." On February 12th, Detective Khalid called again. "We found human remains behind the cottage wall. Female, mid-20s. Items nearby, a corroded locket engraved E, yellow sundress fragments. DNA confirmation pending, but odds are high." Harriet sat in the staff garden where frost rimed the benches. Cause of death? Preliminary suggests blunt force trauma to the skull. Probably hit the cliff. Possibly pushed, then concealed behind masonry. We'll know more. Harriet exhaled a breath that plumed in cold air. "Thank you. Miss Talbot, may I ask, how did your clients know what to paint?" "I don't fully understand," Harriet admitted. "Maybe empathy's wider than we think. Maybe places remember." Khalid considered. "Whatever the mechanism, you and they helped solve a case. When the family's notified, they'll want to thank you." After the call, Harriet looked at the winter bare trees and felt both wonder and sorrow. A life ended had whispered across decades until enough listeners paid attention. The hospital granted a small budget for a memorial project. Harriet led the design, a mural on the blank wall outside Studio 3. She invited all current and former patients who wished to contribute. They decided, collectively, on a seascape. White cliffs, a calm horizon. In the center, the cottage, windows glowing gold, as though lamps burned within. On the veranda stood a figure in a yellow dress, one hand raised in greeting. They worked through March, layering color. Patients who normally refused group activity picked up brushes. Rose, still fragile but recovering, painted dandelions in the dune grass. Winston mixed the sunset pigments. David, visiting, added fine line work to the porch rail. Sarai contributed script in Farsi lines from her poem. Every wave brings news of the ones we lost. The unveiling drew hospital staff, local journalists, and Eleanor Trent's mother, grey-haired yet upright. She stared at the wall a long time, then hugged Harriet with startling strength. "She's home now," Mrs. Trent said. "You heard her when no one else could." Harriet wanted to reply that she had only listened to her patients, that they were the conduits, but the words snagged behind tears. That evening, alone in the now quiet studio, Harriet tidied stray brushes. Dusk pooled violet outside. She glanced once more at the mural. The painted boy, freshly varnished, caught the light and seemed to sway. A soft knock sounded, though the real door behind her was open and unmoving. Harriet smiled, unsure whether the sound came from memory, imagination, or something less explainable. She spoke aloud, voice steady. "It's all right. We opened it." Then she switched off the lights and went home, leaving the sea of color to glow in the corridor, a promise that art patient, persistent, could carry a message across 30 silent years and guide a lost soul back to shore.